Today we will take a journey to the exotic, faraway land of beautiful, supernatural British Columbia. British Columbia is thought to be composed of many ancient volcanic island chains called terranes that docked against the continent and facilitated the building of mountain belts. The landforms we see today are much different than they were following the accumulation of these terranes. Glaciation from the last ice age is responsible for most of the current landscape, as the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets covered a majority of the northern reaches of North America. As they receded, they left behind carved valleys and depressions, some resembling the fjords seen along the coastline. As meltwater found its way to the sea, it filled in the deep gouges left by the ice, resulting in water bodies we call fjord-type lakes. Lake Quesnel owes its existence to this flavor of formation. A historically oligotrophic dimictic lake, its maximum depth in the east arm is over 500 meters, making it the deepest fjord-type lake in the world, the deepest lake in BC, and the second deepest in Canada. It has a maximum length of 100 kilometers from west to east arms, a maximum fetch in the north arm of 35 kilometers, shoreline length of 325 kilometers, and a volume of 4,180,000,000 cubic meters. Water in the lake basin has a residence time of 11 years and is fed to the lake principally from the Horsefly River to the south and the Mitchell River to the north, exiting from its west arm into the Quesnel River. Quesnel, despite its low nutrient content, is a critical system for sockeye salmon. These fish colonized BC shortly after the ice sheets receded and exposed countless kilometers of rivers and the lakes that sockeye depend on for rearing. The Quesnel River empties into the Fraser about midway along its run through the province, the Fraser River hosting the largest sockeye salmon fishery in BC, with Quesnel supplying 30% of these fish. In 1914, anthropogenic changes to Hell's Gate Canyon at lower Fraser reaches caused a landslide that prevented fish migration upstream for several years. This dropped populations from 12 to 4 million, and elevated commercial and sports fishing kept populations low for more than half a century. Conservation efforts increased the number of fish reaching their spawning grounds, and the population has been rebounding since the 70s. The larger sockeye runs have what is called a 4-year cyclical pattern, one dominant year followed by a smaller subdominant run and 2 years of very small returns. After the low numbers in the runs of the 20th century, ebb and flow in annual counts escalated to the historic 2010 sockeye return, with almost 30 million fish making their way back to the headwater streams. Based on the cyclical pattern of sockeye, 2014 promised to be a pivotal year. The Aboriginal peoples of BC have depended on the province's salmon for millennia. When Europeans first arrived, they found a mosaic of interconnected yet independent nations occupying the entire landscape and successfully managing the fisheries. While there were laws and rules governing the harvest of fish, effective management was achieved through a universal and profound respect for the fish. There was the belief that all living things were once human and salmon were considered ancestors. They were also recognized as distinct genetic lines, and perpetuation of each lineage was assured through ceremonial abstinence of harvest and ingenious fishing technology, such as rings of willow sewn into nets, both allowing a certain portion of fish to escape and spawn. Salmon were not only an important source of food, but were used for international commerce, religious ceremonies, and as a barometer for the health of a nation. Colonization changed matters profoundly, despite an effort by the British Crown to protect the rights of First Nations people. The 1763 Royal Proclamation issued by King George III decreed that all land is considered Aboriginal until ceded by treaty. To date, nearly the entire BC province consists of unceded lands. As mineral exploitation took hold and colonists began expanding, the rights of First Nations were violated through a long history of racist laws and regulations aimed at assimilation. The First Nations believed that the people belonged to the land and were therefore responsible for its care. The environmental destruction caused by mining alone has provoked many nations to stand up and demand recognition of their Aboriginal title and rights, to protect the fish, the rivers, and the land. The value of the mining industry has caused these assertions to be ignored. There are projects throughout the province, and today it is estimated that resource extraction is worth more than $350 billion. In 2014, the industry grossed $8.2 billion, with nearly $500 million being paid to the government of BC in taxes. Mines and related industries employ nearly 50,000 people. As technologies advanced, it became possible to extract metals from very poor quality rock, of course creating more wastes and presenting the problem of where to store the caustic chemical sludge used to isolate the target materials. In 40 years, a typical mine went from producing tens of thousands of tons in waste to hundreds of thousands. Many operations, such as the Poly Mountain Mining Company owned by Imperial Metals, employ the use of a tailings storage facility. The waste is dumped into a body of water impounded by an earthen dam and allowed to settle, the water keeping chemicals from being exposed to the elements. This technology is over a century old, devised when wastes were created at a much smaller volume, and is notorious for failure. Polymine's tailings facility reached its limit in 2011, and over the years Imperial Metals has built up the earthen dam to accommodate for more waste input, despite warnings from authorities that the dam was too high. Permit applications were submitted to discharge toxic water overflow into nearby Poly Lake, but denied due to the unsafe levels of metals and chemicals. So, during the summer of 2014, the impoundment building continued, residents downstream watching with apprehension, the previous year's sockeye juveniles eating quenelle crustaceans in the Clear Lake waters, and the potentially massive 2014 sockeye run beginning to travel up the Fraser towards home. The devastation was unprecedented. Tailings first entered Poly Lake, raising water levels by more than 2 meters and diverting the remaining sludge down Hazeltine Creek, where chemicals burned the trees and cut a 100-meter wide path where there once was a single-meter wide mountain stream. Hazeltine enters Quesnel along its west arm, and the slurry of waste from Poly Mine created a 600-meter wide, 1,200-meter long, 3-meter thick deposit of heavy metals along the lake bottom. The Quesnel River Research Center was there immediately taking samples and readings, and discovered through turbidity testing and temperature profiles that a plume of sediment weighing an estimated 30 million kilograms was suspended in the water column below the thermocline at 30 meters. Due to Quesnel's large size, the presence of high adjacent mountains and associated katabatic winds, and a shallow sill separating the west arm from the main basin, metalimnetic seiches causing hypolimnetic upwelling were known to occur. These internal waves can exchange up to 30% of the hypolimnion between the west and main basins, and substantial amounts of the cold underlying water exit the system via Quesnel River. High winds in the weeks following the tailings pond breach perpetuated a seishing event causing the suspended plume to migrate both into the main lake basin and out the Quesnel River. Currents and waves aided distribution in the eastern reaches, and turbidity during the subsequent two lake turnovers revealed persistence of the suspended sediments throughout the water column. Polymine operations were required to stop, although pumping from Poly Lake into Hazeltine Creek began immediately following the breach and continued into October. Residents of nearby towns were told not to drink the water, even after Imperial Metals President Brian Kynoch made the statement that the tailings pond contained water very close to drinking quality and that he would drink the water himself. When publicly offered water collected by a lake resident, he was not available for comment. 5 days after the breach, the water ban was lifted in many communities, but over 500 kilometers downstream in Lytton, fish were being caught with their skin peeling off. Haklip, Sequelwas, and Sequilix chiefs issued a warning ceasing all fishing activity along the Fraser River in their territories, stating, "We do not take the issue lightly, the contaminants in the river are highly toxic." The Secwepemc Fisheries Commission further north near the origin of the spill also strongly advised people to stop fishing immediately. Secwepemc women gathered at the gates of Poly Mine to light a sacred fire and bear witness to the event. creating an encampment that lasted 2 weeks and included several First Nations, many community members of the towns of Likely and Williams Lake, and workers from the Poly mine. Over the weeks following the event, the BC Ministry of Environment released reports on water and sediment quality, stating that there was no human health risk, but that levels of copper, iron, aluminum, and chromium were elevated beyond guidelines for the safety of aquatic life. Fish tissues examined were found safe for normal human consumption, but First Nations leaders were quick to point out that normal human consumption was very different from Indigenous, and that bioaccumulation was of great concern. On August 18th, the government of British Columbia, the Williams Lake Indian Band, and the Soda Creek First Nation signed a letter of understanding committing all parties to an open dialogue about changing laws and regulations regarding mining, with Indigenous peoples' interests and well-being in mind, as well as the economic importance of the industry. Three months later, the two First Nations and several other bands forming the Northern Secwepemc-Taquelmuk Leadership Council released a document that clearly defined the way mining would be conducted in their unceded territory. The statement was made that the document was not a request or wish list, but Indigenous law, protected by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the British Royal Proclamation. Secwepemc leaders say that the Poly incident represents the risk that all resource extraction projects pose, and that legislation reform was mandatory. On January 30, 2015, results from an independent engineering investigation found that the failure of the dam was mainly due to an unknown subterranean layer of unstable glacial till, removing the primary blame from Imperial Metals. It was found, however, that the company was not operating by the best available practices, and that factors resulting from poor management contributed to the disaster. The panel criticized the use of centuries-old technology and predicted that at least two similar events would occur every decade unless the best available technology replaced the outdated earthen dams, stating that the panel firmly rejects any notion that business as usual can continue. The provincial government promised to follow at least a few of the several recommendations made by this review, met with strong opposition by First Nations leaders who stated this is not a smorgasbord, and the recommendations were holistic and could not be cherry-picked. Prior to the completion of investigations into the long-term effects of the spill and after a minimal cleanup effort aimed mainly at aesthetics, on July 9th the government approved a temporary permit allowing polymine operations to resume at half-mast. Discharge of waste effluent was not permitted, the tailings being deposited into the inactive Springer pit on site that was estimated to fill within the year. This decision was aggressively criticized both in First Nations and Canadian communities, and consent of the Secwepemc Nation had not been granted. The news came only a month after the BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council released a 40-page report summarizing the potential effects of similar mining operations using the same brand of technology throughout British Columbia. The report states that nearly 10,000 kilometers of rivers in 250 communities, both First Nation and Canadian, are directly downstream and would be devastated by the inevitable dual spill event per decade predicted by the independent panel. In November, following heavy snows that pushed the Springer pit past capacity, the province approved a 2-year permit to discharge tailings water into Hazeltine Creek, where it would enter a newly constructed water treatment facility and then be piped 30 meters below the surface of Quesnel. Williams Lake Chief Anne Louis said that the motion was reluctantly approved by First Nations involved in negotiations prior to the permit's release, but at least they are making attempts to clean the water now. The long-term impacts of the tailings sediment plume and its ultimate migration into the Fraser River watershed remain unknown. Many in the First Nations communities are calling the event and the behavior of governing bodies an act of genocide, and the communities of Likely and Williams Lake are outraged at what they consider willful negligence fueled by economic incentive. Communities in Alaska along watercourses originating in Canada are becoming concerned about other Canadian-approved mining projects upstream that use dangerous and negligent techniques. Only time will tell how the sockeye have weathered the devastation to their habitat and what the effects up and down the food chain will be.